The morning sun rose gently over the Busan coastal highway, painting the waves in shades of gold. A small diner stood by the roadside, its windows fogged with steam from fresh coffee and hot fish stew. Outside, the low rumble of engines echoed like a steady heartbeat. A group of riders, known as the Iron Wings, had gathered there, their black motorcycles lined neatly in a row. Laughter mixed with the sound of clinking cups as they joked around, teasing one another like brothers. Despite their rough jackets and scarred hands, there was a quiet warmth in the way they treated each other, men who had seen pain but still chose loyalty. Among them sat Minho, their leader. In his early 30s, broad-shouldered and quiet, he carried an air of calm authority. He spoke little, but when he did, the others listened. Beneath his cold eyes lived a softness he never showed, the kind that still believed in doing what's right, even when the world didn't notice. Outside, the wind carried the sound of waves and distant traffic. For a brief moment, everything felt peaceful, as if the day would pass like any other. None of them knew that within minutes, their morning would turn into something they'd never forget. If you still believe that even the toughest hearts can do good, leave a comment and tell us, do you believe in kindness? A sudden scream tore through the calm, slicing the morning air like glass. The laughter outside the diner stopped instantly. Every head turned toward the sound, a small, trembling voice echoing from down the road. A little girl, no older than 7, came running barefoot along the gravel. Her red dress was dusty, her hair tangled, and her face streaked with tears and dirt. "Please!" she cried, her tiny voice breaking. "They're hurting my mama!" The Iron Wings stood frozen, unsure if they had heard her right. One of them, Taijun, glanced at Minho. "She's just a kid," he muttered, his voice low but uneasy. The others stayed silent, watching the little girl stumble forward, clutching her knees, gasping for breath. Minho stepped out first. His boots scraped the ground as he crouched down to her level. "Hey," he said softly, his tone careful. "Tell me what happened." The girl, still sobbing, pointed back toward the distant road, where a line of shabby homes sat beneath the trees. "They're hitting her," she said, her voice trembling. "My mama, she's screaming." A heavy silence fell over the group. Minho's jaw tightened. The warmth in his eyes turned to steel. Around him, the others exchanged uncertain glances, but he didn't wait for anyone's approval. "Get the bikes," he said, voice low but firm. "We're not just standing here." As the engines roared to life, the girls' cries faded behind them, replaced by the thunder of wheels on asphalt. Minho reached out and gently wiped the tears from Hanul's cheek. "Don't worry," he said in a calm, steady voice. "We'll find your mother." He lifted her slightly so she could catch her breath. "Where is she?" he asked. The little girl pointed shakily down the winding road toward an old neighborhood near Jinhai, her small hand trembling in fear. Without another word, Minho turned to his brothers. "Dongwu Taijun, with me." The two men nodded, their usual grins gone, replaced by silent determination. The sound of motorcycles filled the air again, louder this time, sharper like thunder before a storm. Minho slipped on his gloves, glanced once more at the terrified girl, and said quietly, "Stay here. We'll bring her back." The engines roared as the 3 riders took off down the highway, cutting through the cold coastal wind. Dust and sea mist swirled around them, the horizon blurring as the bikes raced past the fields and rusted fences. Inside the diner, Hanul stood at the window, her tiny hands pressed against the glass. The reflection of the departing motorcycles flickered in her teary eyes. She whispered to herself, "Please, bring Mama back." The road stretched endlessly ahead, and the Iron Wings rode faster, guided not by maps, but by the desperate cry of a child that still echoed in their hearts. The narrow road led them into a forgotten part of town, rows of old houses with cracked walls and flickering lights. The air smelled of rust and rain. As they slowed down, a faint sound reached them, shouting, then a scream. Minho's hands tightened on the handlebars. He nodded once, and the 3 bikes stopped outside a small, broken house. The front door was half open. Inside, something crashed, a bottle shattering, followed by a woman's cry. Without hesitation, Minho kicked the door open. The scene froze before him. A man, reeking of alcohol, had cornered a woman against the wall. Her face was swollen, her arms raised to block another strike. Before the man could hit her again, Minho lunged forward, grabbing his wrist mid-swing. The man's eyes widened as Minho twisted his arm sharply and shoved him against the wall. The bottle dropped and shattered at their feet. Dongwoo and Taejun rushed in, holding the man down with force. The air filled with heavy breathing, the sound of boots scraping against the wooden floor. The woman, Soo-jin, trembled as she sank to the ground, her breath short and uneven. Minho crouched beside her. "You're safe now," he said softly, his voice still rough from anger. Outside, the sound of police sirens grew closer. Someone in the neighborhood must have called for help. Minho turned toward the restrained man, eyes cold. "You don't touch her again," he said quietly. Ever. When the police finally arrived, they found 3 bikers standing calmly in the yard, and a terrified woman holding her bruised face, whispering "thank you" over and over. The morning sun was climbing higher when the roar of engines returned to the diner. People nearby turned at the sound, expecting the usual chaos, but what they saw instead silenced them completely. Minho stepped off his bike first, his jacket streaked with dust. In his arms, little Hanul clung tightly, her eyes red from crying but filled with relief. Behind him, Dongwoo and Taejun walked slowly beside Soo-jin, her face bruised, her steps unsteady, but alive. The few locals outside the diner stood frozen. Even the cook paused at the window, wiping his hands on his apron, unsure of what he was seeing. The same bikers everyone avoided were now walking side by side with a woman and her child, their silence heavier than any words. Minho stopped near the steps of the diner and gently set Hanul down. The girl immediately ran to her mother, wrapping her small arms around Soo-jin's waist. The crowd watched as the two held each other, crying softly. Minho removed his leather jacket and draped it around Soo-jin's shoulders. "You're safe now," he said quietly. Police cars rolled up a minute later, lights flashing red and blue across the wet pavement. The officers took the man away in handcuffs, without a struggle. When one of them turned to ask what had happened, Minho just shook his head. "No one ignores a child's cry," he said simply. The officer hesitated, then nodded with respect. Around them, people began to whisper, not with fear this time, but with something that sounded like gratitude. Rain fell softly over Busan that week, washing away the dust that clung to the streets. In a small apartment near the harbor, Soo-jin sat by the window, bandages still around her wrist, watching Hanul draw with bright crayons on the floor. The sound of motorcycles could be heard faintly in the distance. The iron wings had kept their promise. Every few days, Minho and his brothers stopped by, sometimes bringing groceries, sometimes fixing the broken window, sometimes just sitting quietly over bowls of soup, talking about nothing in particular. To the neighbors, they were still a mystery. To Soo-jin and Hanul, they had become family. One evening, as the rain poured harder, Minho arrived soaked from the ride. Hanul ran to him with her usual excitement. "Ah, Juicy," she said, holding up her drawing proudly. "Look, it's you!" He smiled faintly and ruffled her hair. "That's a handsome version of me," he said with a chuckle. Soo-jin, watching from the kitchen, smiled for the first time in weeks. Her bruises were fading, but the kindness she had received had already begun to heal, something deeper. When Minho stood to leave, Hanul followed him to the door. "Are you coming back tomorrow?" she asked. He glanced at the rain outside, then back at her. "As long as you keep smiling like that," he said softly, "we'll always come back." That night the rain didn't sound lonely anymore. It sounded like promise. Spring sunlight returned to the coast, soft and golden. The diner windows gleamed again, and the air carried the smell of freshly brewed coffee and salt from the sea. The iron wings were back at their favorite table, laughter once more filling the air. But this time, something was different. The door opened, and Hanul came running in, her little backpack bouncing behind her. "Minho Ajusi," she called, waving a folded paper above her head. Minho turned, smiling as she rushed over. She stopped in front of him, slightly out of breath, and unfolded her drawing. Crayons covered the page. 3 motorcycles, a small girl in a red dress, and a tall man kneeling beside her with a kind smile. Above them, in clumsy handwriting, it said, "My angels." For a moment, the diner went quiet. Minjo looked at the drawing, then at the child beaming proudly before him. His eyes softened. He carefully folded the paper and slipped it inside his leather jacket. "That's going with me wherever I ride," he said. Sujin entered a moment later, her steps steady now, her face glowing with health. She bowed slightly to the men. "Thank you," she said softly. "For everything," Minho shook his head. "It was your daughter," he said. She was the brave one. Outside, the sound of motorcycles rumbled faintly as other riders arrived, more members of the Iron Wings, smiling as they greeted the small family. If this story touched your heart, share it and tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you heard a child cry for help? Days turned into weeks, and life slowly found its rhythm again. The little girl and her mother moved into a small apartment near the coast, where the ocean wind carried the scent of salt and freedom. Every Sunday morning, the low rumble of motorcycles echoed down the narrow street. The bikers never stopped visiting. They'd bring food, toys, sometimes just laughter, sitting quietly over cups of coffee while the child's giggles filled the air. One afternoon, as cherry blossoms drifted through the air, the girl handed the biker a small drawing. Her mother, and a group of bikers under a bright blue sky. He smiled, carefully folding the paper and sliding it into his leather vest. "This one rides with me," he said softly. As the engines roared to life again, the mother and daughter waved from the doorway, hope reflected in their eyes. The road stretched ahead, endless and bright, carrying not just bikers, but brothers who proved that kindness still rides among us.